this week's Energy Transition Dialogue Hydrogen Full Court Press featured interview. Today we have with us Daryl Wilson, Executive Director of the Hydrogen Council. Welcome, Daryl.
It's good to be with you.
Fantastic. Daryl, it's a really exciting time when it comes to hydrogen and global scale. Before we get into anything, I would like to know, in terms of what is happening with the energy transition, do you think hydrogen is the leader when it comes to all of this?
Well, we've got a big job to do when it comes to the energy transition, and we need a lot of solutions. So we're not claiming to be the leader or the solution, but we think we're a very critical part of the overall solution. Ultimately, by 2050, we expect that hydrogen will be 22% of the final energy mix. So that's a huge contribution, but I'm not going to assert that we're the leader.
That's fantastic. So in terms of the traditional building blocks of the hydrogen economy, what would you say these are, or what do they actually consist of?
Well, today hydrogen is used extensively in our systems for making ammonia for fertilizer to keep our food growing. It's used in the production of fuel. And so there are a number of industrial uses of hydrogen, which we expect will be decarbonized with new processes around removing the carbon, either with fossil fuel sources or generating hydrogen from renewable energy sources such as electrolysis and wind and solar energy. So the industrial sector is certainly important. Beyond that, a huge contribution in transportation. As we electrify transportation, hydrogen will be a way of bringing energy, especially to heavy duty and public transport, and ultimately aviation and marine transport. So the transport sector is very important. And then there are other sectors as well. But one of the things that's sometimes not recognized is hydrogen's an important part of our future energy system, where we need to bring more renewables online, and hydrogen is a way to store very large amounts of energy, so that when the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, we have the ability to get energy from renewable sources and store it in the form of hydrogen. So there are systemic contributions that hydrogen makes, as well as those examples I've given for industry and transport.
Now, in terms of looking at hydrogen and the colors that we're looking at, do any colors in terms of, whether it's gray or it's even pink hydrogen, are we looking at any of them leading the hydrogen make globally, or is it just green overall that takes the lead when it comes to all of this?
Hydrogen is sometimes a little bit complex and difficult to understand, and someone tried to help in creating this color system. Frankly, I think it adds more confusion than helps the situation. So one of the reasons for the color system is to explain all these different pathways. So the color system is a way of talking about the different pathways of how we produce and use hydrogen, and it's mildly helpful that way. But another reason for the colors has been also to talk about the carbon content. And in this respect, the color system is not helpful, because I can easily show you blue hydrogen projects, which are much greener than green hydrogen projects, and the whole thing becomes very difficult to follow and understand. So I think it's important, when it comes to the carbon footprint of hydrogen pathways, we need a transparent, clear system that actually says, how many kilograms of CO2 are being emitted per kilogram of hydrogen being produced, so that it becomes very concrete and transparent, and we get away from the whole color system. In terms of describing the various pathways, no, there's no one clear winner. We're going to see hydrogen coming from fossil fuel sources, from renewable energy sources. We'll see hydrogen moving around the world. It was in ammonia, in direct reduced iron, in very many different derivatives of hydrogen. So unfortunately, yes, it's a little complex, and really the colors don't help too much.
When it comes to the global energy transitions that we're seeing all around the world, is hydrogen the leader when it comes to this energy transition?
Well, we're careful not to claim to be the leader, although we will make a very large contribution. The Hydrogen Council has published reports suggesting that hydrogen will be 22% of final energy use by 2050. So that's a huge contribution. but there are many solutions needed to tackle climate change, and 20% is not enough to solve the
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. So, in terms of creating this entire building blocks of hydrogen in an economy, what would you say are the elements that go into creating the perfect hydrogen economy?
So today, hydrogen is in widespread use, 90 million metric tons a year in industry, and we expect those industrial applications will be decarbonized as part of the transition. So this is making ammonia fertilizer and where hydrogen is used throughout industry. In addition, there are mobility applications where hydrogen will be a big part of electrifying our transport system, and hydrogen fuel cells will be powering trucks, buses, planes. Hydrogen will be powering marine transport. Transport's another very critical sector. And then I sometimes like to make reference to the systemic contribution that hydrogen makes. So as we use more wind and solar on the grid, we need very large energy storage capability, and hydrogen plays an important role there as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you remember a couple of years ago, the buzz was all about renewables and moving into, like you said, solar and wind and all of that. And now suddenly there's a huge shift, even in terms of investments into the hydrogen markets. What are your thoughts and views about that? Are we looking at the need for more investments to kind of have the hydrogen as one of them on board? What do you think about that?
Well, indeed, hydrogen's sort of like the second wave of renewables. So as renewable energy became a larger part of our grid systems, we recognized the need for a complementary system for storage, stabilization, and for distributing renewable energy around the world. The Hydrogen Council just recently published a report on hydrogen trade and trade flows of hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives around the world. And hydrogen's one way where we can take the wind and the sun that is so plentiful in some regions and then move it to those regions that don't have those renewable resources and give them the opportunity to use decarbonized renewable energy also, even though they might not have strong local sources of renewable energy.
Right. And like you rightly said, it's all about the regions. And now we see, a lot of these net zero goals that are coming up in terms of countries. And when it comes to these regions, say, for example, Australia or Europe or the Middle East, in your opinion, which one do you think is perhaps doing the best when it comes to taking on board hydrogen within their plans and policies? What's your take on that?
Well, the race is only getting underway, and so it's a little bit early to start saying who's the leader. I can tell you that there's tremendous activity going on in China and Korea, where policy and funding is already well deployed and a lot of projects are underway. We see a very large portfolio of projects in Europe, more than 350 projects at megawatt scale or greater. Unfortunately held up by some uncertainty around regulation and legislation to enable those projects to go ahead. But I do anticipate in the coming months that's going to be resolved, and then really they've been working for the last 5 years in Europe to develop such a strong portfolio of activity. And then just recently, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has turned all heads in that direction, where there's some very substantial funding available to move hydrogen ahead. So what we're very pleased about is to see around the globe very substantial progress and leadership to make sure that hydrogen can deliver on the great promise it has for decarbonization.
That's really interesting. And also I'd like to talk about in terms of, the supply and demand of hydrogen globally. Of course, we know that, everything is in its developmental phase, but moving forward, there also has to be some sort of demand to kind of meet that. What's your take on that when we look at, the supply and demand of hydrogen? Do we see mechanisms, maybe somewhat similar to the oil markets coming into being in the coming years?
Well, you're quite right. The demand side is very important to put focus on lots of sources of supply, but it's typically policy signals from governments and the regions around the world saying what exactly do they want to do with the hydrogen and what use cases will be supported. We were very encouraged to see just last week announcements out of the EU supporting hydrogen in transport, and the proposition that fueling stations be placed along major highways at certain planned intervals. This kind of leadership on policy design means that there will be demand and uptake in the transportation sector, and that application will start to take root and grow up in Europe. Elsewhere, for example, in the United States, we see the hydrogen hubs policy. This is where in a specific region, a cluster of end use cases will be deployed all together as a set. And that's a way of concentrating demand. It's a good way to get started. We're seeing that with the IEA Ports Initiative. So hydrogen ports, also sometimes called in other places hydrogen valleys, where there's a cluster of industrial activity. So clustering and grouping demand to get started is an absolutely positive approach that we're seeing taking place in many locations.
That's really great. And when you talk about these clusters of hydrogen, does it help that hydrogen has colors as well? We're talking about, the gray and now recently pink as well. Is that something that adds to it when we're looking at hydrogen being a part of, the foreseeable future?
Well, maybe adds to the confusion. Originally, I think the color scheme was invented to bring clarity, but in fact, it's added to the confusion. And we started having discussions about blue versus green hydrogen. What we need is a very clear, transparent system to talk about the kilograms of CO2 that are emitted per kilogram of hydrogen produced, so that there's a very clear indicator just how green the hydrogen is from whatever source it may arise. The complexity is that there are many different pathways to generate hydrogen in many use cases. And over time, I think we'll start grounding some of those use cases in actual stories where people are saying, seeing fleets of buses or trucks, and they can talk about hydrogen in transport more concretely than just using the color system.
That really makes a lot of sense. Also, I'm thinking on top of my head when it comes to hydrogen. When we're looking at regions, when we're looking at progression of hydrogen within the regions across the world, of course, there has to be maybe one or two key elements that allows you to accelerate the hydrogen economy. What do you think they are?
Well, when we look at the movement of hydrogen between regions, when it comes to trade, certification schemes are very, very critical. This means that when one country is importing hydrogen from another, an exporter, it's very clear and transparent what is the environmental footprint of that hydrogen. We call that certification. What we're looking to create over the coming months and years is one clear, coherent system that's widely used and allows that trade of hydrogen to take place where everybody understands the background and environmental footprint of the hydrogen that's being generated, and they can trust that system because it's a universally recognized global system. So that's something that we're working on. It takes some time to get consensus and clarity, but our expectation is by having a clear system for certification, we can enable hydrogen trade.
But do you also see demand security being on the top of your charts?
Well, naturally, with all that's happened in the world in recent months, there's a big focus on energy security and the security of supply for energy in various regions. You'll recognize very shortly after the war started in Ukraine, the European Union doubled their target for hydrogen, recognizing it as a key vector for the future to secure a decarbonized energy supply. So hydrogen, again, is part of the solution here. It's not an immediate part of the solution for 2022 because a lot of the hydrogen work is in early development, but we do anticipate in the coming years there will be kind of a democratization of supply and much more choice for countries to make when it comes to their energy security.
Fantastic. And let's wrap this whole session in terms of, what do you see are the main challenges today in terms of, building an infrastructure, considering that there's a lot of shifts, like you mentioned, between, geopolitical situations. What do you think those could be the main challenges?
Well, we're seeing leadership around the world. Just recently, the announcement with the European Union that I mentioned for hydrogen and transport. This is what nucleates the work around infrastructure. When there's a plan and a vision that hydrogen will serve in a particular capacity, then the plans get concrete with actual infrastructure rollout plans, funding, policy. So we're just now at the stage where I think some of the previous clusters of projects where there's all kinds of ideas headed in all kinds of different directions start to converge into an infrastructure system that has a definitive purpose, such as the transport example that I just raised.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we all know globally we have, the sustainable goals of 2030, net zero goals of 2050. What is your outlook, to sum it all up, your outlook for the future of hydrogen moving forward?
Well, every region of the world has a hydrogen story. They just need to do a little work and find it.
Yeah.
And what we're going to see is those hydrogen stories growing up and having a nuanced, detailed background and face, whether it's renewable energy from Australia or Chile, whether it's decarbonized resources from the Middle East. I think we're going to see a lot of variations in the hydrogen stories around the world, but indeed a huge contribution toward mitigating climate change, which is the most important story we need to be a part of.
Fantastic. And I'm going to just add one more question to it. Do you see pipelines or shipping, infrastructure coming in with the future requirements of hydrogen as well?
I mentioned earlier our recent study on hydrogen trade, and you can find that on our website. Indeed, 2/3 of the hydrogen will be on the move and delivering the decarbonization capability of hydrogen in trade, import, export. And pipelines and shipping will, of course, play a significant role there. Already there is many thousands of kilometers of hydrogen pipeline being used for industry. So pipelines are not new. We also anticipate some of the existing pipeline system used for natural gas will be repurposed, either with blended hydrogen or pure hydrogen. But yes, long distance transport of energy using hydrogen is going to be an important part of the future, both with shipping and pipelines. That's
fantastic. And thank you so very much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure having you here with us. For all our listeners who are joining us as well, please feel free to log in and check out the Hydrogen Council and all the wonderful work that they are doing. And also, here's to more hydrogen hubs popping up all across the world. Thank you once again, Daryl. It has been really great being a part of this entire energy transition dialogues.
Thanks very much.